I heard my husband's voice through a hospital door, and in one sentence he erased 6 years of my life. Once the promotion clears, I divorce her. She's already paid for everything we'll ever need. My sister laughed. My mother agreed. Nobody knew I was standing 3 feet away, holding a gift I had wrapped with my own hands. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I turned around, walked back to my car, and started building the kind of ending they never saw coming. My name is Adeline, and this is the story of how the people who were supposed to love me most tried to erase me from my own life, and how I made sure they'd never forget my name again. For most of my life, I was the reliable one. Not the favorite, not the golden child, just the one people counted on when something needed to get done, paid for, or quietly fixed. My younger sister Delphine was the one who got the soft voice from our mother, the extra patience, the benefit of every doubt. I was the one who got told to be understanding, to be the bigger person, to let things go. I told myself it didn't matter. I had built a life that felt solid from the outside. A marketing director job I'd worked 11 years to earn. A townhouse in Denver with a garden I actually kept alive. And a husband, Weston, who used to look at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. We got married when I was 28. The first few years were good, genuinely good, not the kind of good you have to convince yourself of later. Weston worked in commercial real estate, chasing a promotion to senior partner that always seemed to be one deal away. I supported that chase. I picked up more of our shared expenses when his commissions were slow. I told myself that's what partnership meant. Then came the years of trying for a baby, 3 miscarriages, 2 rounds of fertility treatment that drained both our savings and something harder to name. Somewhere in that stretch of appointments and waiting rooms, Weston started pulling away in small increments I didn't want to notice. Fewer questions about how I was doing. More late nights he called closing dinners. A new habit of stepping out of the room when his phone rang. I told myself marriages go through seasons. I told myself grief does strange things to people. I told myself a lot of things, because the alternative was looking directly at what was actually happening, and I wasn't ready. Delphine, meanwhile, was living the life our mother had always quietly wanted for one of us. She was 26, unmarried, and had spent the last year being vague about a relationship she refused to name. When she announced she was expecting, our mother, Corinne, treated it like a miracle. When I had lost pregnancy after pregnancy, Corinne had treated it like an inconvenience I should stop dwelling on. "Some women just aren't built for that," she told me once, stirring sugar into her coffee like she hadn't just handed me a wound with a spoon. I never asked Delphine who the father was. She never offered. I assumed, the way you assume things about people you've stopped expecting honesty from, that she had her reasons, and that eventually I'd find out along with everyone else. I had no idea how close to home the answer actually was. Looking back now, there were smaller signs I brushed past without letting myself examine them too closely. A perfume that wasn't mine lingering faintly on one of Weston's jackets, which I convinced myself was probably from a crowded elevator or a client meeting. A weekend work retreat he attended alone that had no hotel confirmation email I could find when I went looking for the itinerary to plan around it. A period of about 4 months where he started keeping his phone face down on every surface, a habit so small I almost didn't notice it had started at all. I wasn't oblivious. I think, if I'm honest with myself, I was tired. Tired of chasing explanations. Tired of being the one who noticed things and then had to decide what to do with the noticing. After the 3rd miscarriage, I had made a quiet decision, somewhere I never said out loud, that I didn't have the capacity to fight 2 losses at once, the loss of the family I'd hoped for, and the loss of the marriage I still wanted to believe in. So I chose to believe in the marriage. I gave it the benefit of every doubt I had left. My friends outside the family noticed things I didn't want to. My coworker Marisol asked me once, gently over lunch, whether Weston still asked how my appointments went. I told her he did. It wasn't entirely a lie, he asked. He just stopped waiting around for the answer. The morning Delphine gave birth, I woke up early and drove to a boutique across town that made custom baby blankets. I picked ivory thread on soft gray fabric, had it stitched with the baby's initials, BM, for Beckett Morales, since Delphine had kept her own last name for him, which I hadn't thought twice about at the time, and bought a small wooden keepsake box to go with it. Weston kissed my forehead on his way out the door that morning, already dressed for what he called a closing meeting that absolutely could not move. "Tell Delphine I'm proud of her," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the hallway mirror. I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange thing to say about a sister-in-law he'd never been especially close to. I filed it away the way I filed away a lot of things back then, noticed, then set aside. The maternity floor at the hospital smelled like antiseptic incarnations. I signed in at the front desk, gift bag in hand, and made my way toward Delphine's room with something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like hope. I wanted to hold my nephew. I wanted to feel like part of something again. Delphine's door was open a few inches. I slowed my steps, not to eavesdrop, but because I heard a voice I recognized instantly, and it stopped me cold. Weston. Not at a closing meeting. Not anywhere near his office. Standing inside my sister's hospital room, sounding more relaxed than he'd sounded with me in months. "She still has no idea," he was saying, and I heard the clink of a paper cup being set down on a table. "As long as she's covering the mortgage, none of this needs to change yet." There was a pause. Someone, Delphine, I think, said something too low for me to catch, and then a soft laugh, tired the way new mothers sound tired, not amused so much as relieved. "He's not wrong," my mother said, and her voice wasn't loud either. If anything, it was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You don't have to decide anything today. Just, let's not make this complicated before it needs to be." "She's going to find out eventually," Delphine said. "Eventually isn't today," Corinne said. "Today we just enjoy him." There was a rustle of blankets, a small sound from the baby, and then Weston again, quieter now, like he was leaning over the bassinet. "Kept your name on the paperwork for now. Easier that way. We'll sort the rest out once things settle." I didn't understand, not fully, what the rest meant. Not yet. I only understood, standing in that hallway, that whatever was being discussed on the other side of that door had clearly already been discussed before, more than once, in rooms I hadn't been in. I stood there holding a gift bag for a baby who, it turned out, was my husband's son, listening to my own mother talk about my marriage the way you talk about a minor scheduling conflict. I didn't open the door. I stepped back. Then again. Then I walked down that hallway like my legs belonged to someone calmer than I felt, past the nurse's station, into the elevator, and caught my own reflection in the steel doors. Pale, dry-eyed, unnervingly still. Something in me had gone quiet in a way that scared me a little. Not numb. Focused. I sat in that parking garage for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself turn the key. The gift bag sat on the passenger seat, the little wooden keepsake box tipped slightly against the seatbelt buckle, and I remember staring at it and thinking about how strange it was that I could feel so much grief for a child I hadn't even met yet. A child who was, in some backward way, still my nephew, still innocent of everything that had just been decided about his future and mine in that hospital room. I thought about calling Weston right there in the garage and asking him to explain himself. I thought about walking back inside and setting that gift bag down in the middle of the room so all three of them could watch my face while I did it. I thought about a dozen versions of that afternoon where I said something, screamed something, broke something. I didn't do any of them. Some instinct underneath the shock was already telling me that the version of this where I reacted immediately was the version where I lost. People who are caught off guard say things they can't take back and make decisions they haven't thought through. I wanted to be the version of myself that thought it through. I didn't fully understand yet what I'd walked in on. I hadn't heard a confession. Not really, just fragments, the kind of half-sentences people use with each other when they've already had the full conversation a dozen times before and don't need to spell it out anymore. I didn't know yet about the promotion, or the apartment, or the lease with my name forged onto it. All I knew, sitting in that garage, was that something between the three of them had been settled without me, and that I had been talked about in a tone reserved for furniture. That was the moment it finally broke through. I don't remember deciding to cry. I remember gripping the steering wheel with both hands and folding forward over it, my forehead pressed against the leather, and just letting it come, ugly, gasping, the kind of crying I hadn't let myself do since the last miscarriage, when I'd promised myself I was done falling apart in parking lots. I cried for the baby I'd bought a blanket for. I cried for 6 years I could suddenly see differently, every small absence recoloring itself into something deliberate. I cried, embarrassingly, for the version of myself who had stood in that hallway feeling hopeful 20 minutes earlier, because she hadn't known yet what I now did. It didn't last long. 6, maybe 7 minutes. But I let it happen completely, because some part of me understood that if I didn't grieve it now in private, it would find a way to leak out later at the worst possible moment, in front of the people who least deserved to see it. When it passed, I wiped my face with the back of my hand, looked at myself in the visor mirror until my breathing evened out, and started the car. I didn't drive home. I sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital, the gift bag still on the passenger seat, and opened the banking app on my phone with hands that had finally stopped shaking. I started pulling at threads I had noticed for months, and never let myself follow. A recurring charge to a private OB clinic I didn't recognize. Rideshare charges on nights Weston said he was working late. A corporate gift expense for baby furniture that had struck me as odd even when I'd glanced past it at the time. Once I actually looked, the pattern assembled itself in minutes. Transfers to Delphine Morales, going back nearly a year. Payments to a furniture company for a nursery set. And an apartment lease in a building downtown, one I had never lived in, never toured, never signed a single document for, that listed my name as a co-signer. I stared at that lease agreement for a long time. The signature at the bottom looked like mine at a glance, close enough that I understood immediately how it had gotten past a leasing office. But it wasn't mine. I know my own signature the way you know your own handwriting, and the loop on the A was wrong, tighter than I ever make it, the kind of detail only the person who actually writes it 1,000 times would notice. I didn't have proof yet. I had a feeling, sharp and cold, that something illegal had happened to my name without my permission. Proving it would take longer than that one afternoon in a coffee shop. That wasn't an affair anymore. That was fraud. I called the only person I trusted enough to hear all of it without flinching, my college roommate Meredith, who had spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state. "Adeline," she answered, "you sound too calm for a Sunday. I need you to walk me through what happens when someone might have forged your signature on a lease," I said. There was a pause. Then quieter. "Tell me everything." I told her. The hospital hallway. My mother's voice. Delphine's laugh. Weston's plans for his son's name. The transfers. The lease. All of it. In the same flat, methodical tone I would use for the rest of that conversation, because if I let myself feel it fully, I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep talking. When I finished, Meredith was quiet for a moment. "This isn't just a broken marriage," she said finally. "This is financial fraud, identity misuse, and a plan that's been running behind your back for the better part of a year. You have more leverage right now than you understand, but only if he doesn't know you understand it. So what do I do?" She walked me through it slowly, the way you'd explain something to someone still in shock, even though my voice hadn't wavered once. She told me that in cases like this, the instinct to confront immediately is almost always the wrong one, not because the anger isn't justified, but because confrontation gives the other side time to prepare, to delete, to rear out money, to get their story straight before anyone official ever asks a single question. "Right now," she said, "you're the only one who knows the whole shape of this. The moment you say something out loud to Weston, that advantage disappears. He'll start covering things. Delphine will start covering things. Your mother will start managing the story instead of living inside it. You have one window where you know more than they think you do. I don't want you to waste it." "Nothing," she said. "Not yet. Let him keep believing you're exactly where he left you. People who think no one's watching get careless. Right now, you're not his wife finding out. You're the only person in this whole situation with a complete picture. Use that." That night, Weston came home smelling like hospital coffee and confidence. "How's Delphine?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of water, casual as ever, like he hadn't spent the afternoon in her hospital room making plans that erased me from his future. "She's good," I said. "The baby's healthy." He smiled, genuinely pleased, and reached out to hug me. I let him. He had no idea that while his arms were around me, I had already started counting down the days until every plan he'd made would collapse in on itself. The next morning, I went to work as though nothing had changed, because in the world Weston, Delphine, and Corinne believed I was living in, nothing had. I sat through a marketing strategy meeting, gave notes on a client campaign, and answered emails with the same efficiency I always had. Nobody in that office had any idea that I had spent the previous evening compiling a folder that would eventually end a marriage, a career, and a family's carefully maintained illusion of itself. That night, and for several nights after, I began keeping two versions of my life running side by side. In one, I was Adeline the wife, warm enough, present enough, unremarkable enough that Weston had no reason to suspect anything had shifted. In the other, I was becoming someone closer to an investigator, someone who read financial statements the way other people read novels, hunting for the sentence that didn't fit. Meredith taught me things I'd never had reason to learn before. How joint account statements can reveal patterns if you know which columns to compare against each other. How to request certified copies of signed documents from a leasing office without tipping off the person who might be watching for exactly that kind of request. How silence, used correctly, can gather more evidence than confrontation ever could. Over the following 3 weeks, I became someone I didn't fully recognize, patient, observant, unbothered on the surface, and relentless underneath it. I kept showing up to family dinners. I kept asking polite questions about Beckett. I kept smiling at my mother across the table while she praised Delphine's glow and asked me in the same breath whether I'd made peace with not having children of my own. Every night, after Weston fell asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with Meredith's guidance and built a file. I found 4 separate transfers from our joint investment account into a private account under Delphine's name, totaling just under $60,000 over 10 months. I found text exchanges Weston had accidentally left synced to our shared cloud storage, a mistake made by a man who had stopped being careful because he assumed I'd stopped paying attention. The messages weren't just about the affair. They were strategic. Weston had been positioning himself for a senior partner promotion at his firm for over a year, one that came with a substantial signing bonus and equity package. In one message to Delphine, he'd written that he needed to keep things stable at home until the promotion cleared because a messy divorce before the deal closed could cost him the position entirely. I wasn't his wife. I was a placeholder with a paycheck, kept in position until I was no longer useful. The forged lease was the piece that would change everything legally if it held up. Meredith sent the documents to a forensic handwriting examiner she'd worked with before and warned me not to expect a fast answer. These things, she said, usually took several weeks, sometimes longer, because a real comparison meant pulling years of my authentic signatures from bank forms, tax filings, and old paperwork, and matching stroke pressure and letter formation across all of it, not just eyeballing 2 documents side by side. It took 19 days. When the report finally came back, it was unambiguous. The signature on the lease was not mine, and showed patterns consistent with tracing rather than natural handwriting. Close enough to pass a leasing office that wasn't looking hard. Not close enough to survive a forensic comparison against 2 decades of documents with my actual signature on them. This is the piece that moves fast once it's confirmed, Meredith told me the day the report arrived. Everything else is a divorce case. This is a criminal one if you want it to be. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about my mother's voice calling me useful. I thought about Delphine's laugh. I thought about Weston's plans for his son's name and how easily he'd said I would simply accept it because I always had. I don't just want a divorce, I told Meredith. I want them to understand exactly what they built this on. There was one more discovery in that stretch of weeks that reshaped how I understood the entire situation, and it didn't come from Weston's records at all. It came from my mother. While going through some old family paperwork, looking for a document unrelated to any of this, a property deed from my late father's estate that Corinne had asked me to help locate, I found a folder of my mother's old bank statements from nearly 15 years earlier, tucked into the same filing box out of habit more than organization. In it was a record of a small, quiet loan Corinne had once taken out under my father's name without his knowledge, to cover a gambling debt she had never once mentioned to either of her daughters. My father had discovered it, according to a handwritten note clipped to the statement, and the two of them had apparently agreed to bury it rather than let it affect the family's image. I sat with that discovery for a long time. It didn't excuse anything Corinne had said in that hospital hallway. If anything, it explained it. My mother's calm, practiced instinct to protect the family's comfort over its honesty wasn't new. It was a pattern she had been living inside for decades, one she had simply passed down the way families pass down almost everything, without ever meaning to, and without ever calling it what it was. It didn't make me forgive her. It made me understand that I wasn't dealing with one betrayal. I was dealing with a family system that had decided, long before I was ever part of it, that certain kinds of dishonesty were acceptable as long as they kept the peace. I had simply been the first person in that system unwilling to keep paying for it. The senior partner promotion Weston had been chasing was set to be announced at his firm's annual spring reception, a black tie event at a downtown hotel where partners, clients, and board members all gathered under one roof. Weston had asked me to come, not because he wanted me there, I now understood, but because a stable, well-dressed wife on his arm was part of the image he needed to maintain until the ink was dry on his new title. I said yes. Meredith and I had spent 2 weeks preparing for that evening, coordinated with a forensic report now finalized, and a private investigator who had quietly gathered financial records showing the pattern of transfers with dates, amounts, and sources. Meredith's plan wasn't to blow anything up in the middle of the ballroom. That kind of scene, she said, tends to make a firm circle the wagons around their own partner instead of taking the claim seriously. Instead, she had arranged for the documentation to reach the firm's general counsel directly, formally, first thing the next business morning, through channels that couldn't be dismissed as a scorned wife making noise at a party. I wore a deep emerald dress Weston had once told me was his favorite. I did my hair the way he liked it. I smiled at his colleagues and answered questions about my marketing work with the kind of composed warmth that made people comfortable. Nobody in that ballroom had any idea what was coming. The firm's managing partner took the stage around 9, thanked the room for another strong year, and announced Weston as the newest senior partner. He shook hands. People applauded. I clapped along with everyone else, and drove home with him that night saying all the right things about how proud I was. The envelope reached the general counsel's office at 8:15 the following morning. I found out later, through pieces Weston let slip over the following days, how it unfolded from there. The general counsel called him in that same afternoon, not with accusations, but with questions, routine sounding at first, about a joint account and a lease agreement that had surfaced in a compliance review. Weston answered carefully, certain it would blow over. It didn't. Firms that finance large commercial deals live and die by their credibility with banks and regulators, and a documented forgery connected to a new partner's personal finances wasn't something legal could simply set aside once it had been formally flagged. 3 days later, Weston was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. A week after that, the investigation turned up a second, unrelated inconsistency in one of his old expense reports, a detail that had nothing to do with me, but that made the firm's decision considerably easier once they were already looking closely at everything else in his file. By the end of that second week, his position had been terminated outright, the senior partner title revoked before it had even appeared on a single piece of letterhead. I didn't confront Weston during any of it. I let the firm do what firms do, quietly, methodically, and without a shred of sentimentality. By the time his termination was final, 3.5 weeks after that reception, he'd stopped bothering to pretend that compliance review was routine. He came home the night he was let go, pale in a way I'd never seen on him, and finally asked me directly whether I knew anything about it. "I know everything," I said. "The transfers, the apartment, the lease with a signature that isn't mine, Delphine, Beckett, all of it. I have for weeks. I watched something in his face rearrange itself in real time, confidence giving way to something closer to panic. "Adeline, I can explain." "You don't need to," I said. "I already have the explanation. It's in a file. Several files, actually." I filed for divorce that same week, with the forged lease documentation attached as an exhibit. Meredith had also, at my direction, forwarded a formal notice to the leasing company's fraud department, which triggered its own separate investigation into how a signature that didn't match 6 years of my banking records had been accepted without verification. The leasing company, unwilling to absorb liability for a documented forgery, moved quickly to terminate the lease altogether, which meant that within a month, the apartment Weston and Delphine had built their imagined future around no longer existed for either of them. The family dinner where everything finally surfaced in full wasn't what I planned. It was Beckett's naming ceremony, 3 weeks later, hosted at my mother's house, where I showed up because Meredith advised that appearing composed and present would say more than staying away ever could. Delphine was radiant, holding her son, accepting compliments about how well he was feeding, how calm he was for a newborn. My mother stood beside her, glowing with a kind of ease I rarely remembered her having around me. I waited until the toasts began. When my mother raised her glass and said something about how grateful she was that everyone who mattered had found their way to this moment, I raised mine too. "To family," I said, "and to everyone who worked so hard to build one, using my name, my accounts, and a signature on a lease that wasn't actually mine." The room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when something true has just landed where no one expected it to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply set my glass down, thanked my mother for hosting, and told her I hoped the three of them had found what they were looking for, because I finally had. Then I left. Corinne called my phone 11 times before I reached my car. I let every call go to voicemail. The messages she left ranged from furious to pleading, each one circling the same core complaint, that I had embarrassed the family, that I had chosen a terrible moment, that I hadn't given anyone the chance to explain. Not one of the 11 messages contained an apology. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Even in the wreckage of what she and my sister had built, my mother's first instinct was still damage control for the family's image, not concern for the daughter standing in the middle of it. Delphine texted once, hours later, "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone." I read it twice, then set the phone down without responding. There was something almost fitting about the fact that her objection wasn't to what had happened, only to the fact that it had finally been said out loud, in a room where she couldn't control how people would look at her afterward. The divorce moved faster than either of us expected, largely because Weston no longer had the resources or the standing to fight it. The forensic evidence around the forged lease and the undisclosed transfers gave Meredith more than enough leverage to secure a settlement that reflected exactly how much of our shared life had, in fact, been funded almost entirely by me. I kept the townhouse. I kept my retirement accounts untouched. I received a settlement that accounted for the $60,000 quietly diverted to support a family I hadn't known existed. The lease company's fraud investigation moved separately and slower, but it moved. Weston was left facing consequences that extended well past our marriage, consequences that had nothing to do with me anymore and everything to do with choices he'd made believing no one was paying close enough attention to notice. Delphine and I have not spoken since the naming ceremony. My mother has called a handful of times, each message some version of asking me to let bygones be bygones for Beckett's sake. I don't return them. Beckett is an innocent child who didn't choose any of this, and none of my anger belongs to him. But being gracious toward a baby and reopening a relationship with the adults who built his existence on my back are two very different things, and I'm no longer interested in confusing them. I moved 6 months later, not far, just to a quieter part of the city, into a smaller place that belongs entirely to me, filled with furniture I chose without asking anyone's opinion. I started running again, something I'd given up during the fertility years. I took on a leadership role at work that I'd been quietly declining for 2 years because I hadn't wanted to disrupt a marriage that, it turns out, had already been disrupted for a very long time. Some mornings I still think about that hospital hallway, the version of me standing there with a gift bag, still hopeful, still trying. I don't regret that she existed. I just don't live as her anymore. The people who called me useful, cold, and difficult built their entire plan on the assumption that I would keep accepting things quietly, the way I always had. They forgot that a woman who pays every bill in a household usually knows exactly where the money goes and exactly how to make it stop. A year out from that hospital hallway, I've started noticing the small, ordinary satisfactions again. The ones that get buried when you spend years managing someone else's secrets without knowing it. Sunday mornings with coffee I don't have to share. A closet that only holds my own clothes. A calendar with no appointments I have to explain to anyone. I still think about Beckett sometimes, and I hope, genuinely, that he grows up in a home more honest than the one that was built around his arrival. That part of this was never his fault, and it never will be. But I've learned that loving a child from a distance and staying entangled with the adults who used you to fund his existence are two choices, not one, and I'm allowed to make them separately. Meredith tells me my case became something of a quiet reference point at her firm, proof that patience, when paired with the right documentation, does more damage to people like Weston than any amount of anger ever could. I believe her. Anger burns fast, and then it's gone. What I built took weeks to assemble and months to unfold, and by the time it was finished, there was nothing left for anyone to argue with. Just records. Just dates. Just the truth, laid out in a format nobody in that family could talk their way around. If someone in your own life had quietly built a future on your money and your name, at what point would you have walked back into that room, and what would you have said?